Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Spring 2021 West Virginia Game Developers Expo special Software Developers Roundtable. I am Patrick Smith, and I'm joined here by three software developers, different fields in their own right. But I want to introduce each and every one here. So first, I'll go ahead and start with Christie Trent. She was born and raised in West Virginia and has worked for 20 years in the tech industry. She's the owner of Athena Blue LLC, where she's a programmer for clients inside and outside of the state of West Virginia, and also Apocalypse Gaming LLC, where she works as a graphic designer and animator for their gaming community. She writes for Hill Tree Roastery, my apologies, a single source small batch coffee roaster out of Huntington, West Virginia, which when I mentioned that the other day, one of my colleagues was like, I go there all the time. So it's a very small world. And you also have a travel blog, Wild and Wandering. You are passionate about programming and helping others and has volunteered with West Virginia Public Schools in the Department of Defense Education activity for the International Hour of Code. So we greatly appreciate you volunteering your time here to come talk to us and talk to people out there who are thinking about getting into the programming field, Christy. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And next, I've got Rob Jenkins. Rob Jenkins has over 30 years in the IT industry as a software developer, network integrator, and Internet of Things designer slash programmer. His experience has been in the service of the medical, insurance, ISP or internet service provider, banking, and other sectors, as well as being a consultant on projects for the U.S. Navy. He is currently an instructor in the Information Technology Department at Mount West Community and Technical College, where he directs the mobile app development program. And you might have actually seen Rob last week giving a talk about mobile app development and how you can get started there. So if not, go check that out. Thank you for being here, Rob.
Thanks for having me, Pat.
And finally, we have Gary Brafford. Gary, from the age of 7, when his father brought home his first computer, a TRS 80, which I like to affectionately call a trash 80.
I think everybody called him that.
Yeah, Gary has been a gamer slash programmer. That love continued through the silver and golden age of consoles, even through the PC renaissance that started in the late 80s till now. He works in C++, C Sharp, Java, HTML, Python, Ruby, and has experience in most of the major game engines, the majority of which was self-taught. So it's going to be an interesting talk with Gary here, learning about his trajectory as well. He has commercially released 2 games on Xbox and PC that are small indie titles, Rofaxon and Kerbang. And Gary is currently in his last semester in our Mount West game development program. And he just got hired by a game development company called Acupara Games, where he is currently making games for all platforms. He is truly a person who is living his dream at this point. Thank you very much for joining us, Gary.
Thank you.
So first off, I'd like to kind of do the roundtable format here and ask each of you all how you all came to programming, how you whether it be doing C++, C Sharp, COBOL, Fortran, or making games. How did you all get into that? Where were you before? So I guess Christy, I'll let you start here talking about your trajectory into software development.
Well, I have very humble beginnings. I actually was working as a maid in Florida, and I just really wanted to learn how to design a website. I just thought it was interesting. I really liked graphics. I had been around computers since I was a kid. My dad had a Commodore 64, and I loved playing on Print Shop Pro and making things and stuff like that. And it really just started with one website as a hobby. And it was on dial-up. So back then, if you wanted to do it, you really had to commit. It's funny looking back just how everything changed and it just happened. I just loved it and I couldn't stop doing it. I just couldn't stop writing code. And I've had a lot of great jobs and mentors to pick up new skills along the way, but that's how I got into it. I just wanted to make a website.
So in your case, like Gary, you went and got a book and you started looking stuff up. You were self-taught at that point?
Yeah, I actually borrowed a book. I didn't even have a computer. I I was living in an RV in Florida, and had a family member, and I would go to their house and use their computer, their dial-up, and this book that I borrowed off someone that had a computer science major, and it was like a CGI HTML JavaScript book. It was this kind of combo, big book. Kind of went from there.
Well, I can think about how anytime I've ever been coding on a web page or whatnot, I always find an error and submit it. And as soon as I submit it, find another error. And it never occurred to me that, back on the dial-up days, you really had to wait to see that commit come back. So
I have no patience now. I have no patience now. And I try to remember those times where, you would just have to sit there and wait and wait and wait and wait. So.
It used to take us 5 minutes to download a picture from the internet. I remember those days. Right. Yes, indeed. So, Rob, will you talk to us about how you came to use and do programming? Where your love came from?
Sure. I started programming when I was 7. Self-taught. I mean, my first exposure to a computer, to a personal computer, or and programming came at the same time. My mom used to shop a lot, and there were like 3 big big retail stores near us, and she would make the rounds between all 3 of them. And one day there was one of the first home computers, Texas Instruments TI 99 4A, on display and all of these things. And for some reason, they left it displayed. The display was, hey, here's a computer, and this is BASIC. Here you can, start with a line number and have it do something, and you can do this and that. And I looked over that kind of thing, and I started programming in department stores. I would write a little bit of code and try out something, and then when she'd come by and say it's time for us to go, I'd leave. We'd go to the next store, and if nobody was on it messing with it, I'd go in and type in everything that I had typed in at the last store, and then start adding new stuff and working on it. And then it was time to go. We'd go to the next store, and I'd do the same thing. Anybody watching at that last store would think, wow, this kid really knows how to program or something. But yeah.
John Nash just walked into the store. They didn't know who John Nash was.
To what?
I said they didn't even know who John Nash was, but you had all those calculations and formulas going on in your head right there.
I just remembered what I had typed in at the last place, but I don't even think BASIC or programming is a good selling point for a personal computer at the time, because they were like super expensive. I don't know what the value proposition was, but I'm glad that they decided to put that on display, because, I just took to it and was immediately interested in it, and begged for a personal computer of my own that Christmas. And it was a TRS-80 color computer, like Gary was talking about earlier. And so, self-taught. I worked with BASIC then. I taught myself 68090 assembler on that machine. And I think then my next machine was a Tandy 1000. And I think the drive for me at the time was not only I love to, turn buttons that I push on this keyboard into making the machine do something, but I think for a period of time there, I was driven by wanting to write games. I thought that was the most interesting thing. Never got to the point that Gary got to of publishing anything, but I learned a lot. And by the time the web came around, I, picked up a whole different set of skills and additional programming skills there to develop websites and do some of the CGI programming required there. And I've just kept up with it. And
so I'm curious, Christie said she borrowed a book from somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And, I remember those days of where at a Sears or whatever, they may have a computer set up. I distinctly remember one time walking through Sears up at the Huntington Mall, which is now where they have the COVID shot, headquarters, and soon to be the Cabell County Career Technical Center for high school students. But when it was still a Sears, they had a machine there, and that's the first time I ever saw Doom. They had Doom playing on the machine.
Yeah.
But I also know, like, in that situation, when you walk up to that computer, they don't just have the manuals laying out there. So, and there was no internet when you were looking at this computer. So how were you even picking up the coding on that Texas Instruments? Like how?
There was at the time there were magazines devoted. There were just very niche magazines devoted to people that, and I think Gary probably remembers this, devoted to people that were programming these different home computers. And they would have code listings inside the magazine. So you would get the monthly magazine and open it up, and oh my gosh, they have Lunar Lander here, and I only have to type in 1,100 lines of code. This will be fine. This is great. And you just start typing it in. And the first home computer that I had, if you wanted to save your program, you had to, it's making me sound incredibly old, which I guess I am. You would save it to a cassette tape, and there was basically sound output from the computer to a cassette recorder, and you would press play and record and pause, and then tell the computer to write out the code to the audio port, and you'd press pause and it would record it, and then that was your file that you would load up. So talking about loading things down from the internet being slow, waiting for your program to load back in off of a cassette tape is pretty slow too. But those were the hard times. We're all spoiled with broadband and flash drives and stuff now. This would have been magic back then.
Oh yeah, I mean, it wasn't that distant future, but I remember buying a 128 meg USB drive for $100.
Oh wow!
And I was happy to get it that cheap.
Oh yeah.
And now I carry around 512 gig ones in my pocket, and you can get them for $15 or $16. It's amazing.
Not to mention the computing power we all have at our fingertips.
That's true. Very, very true. Well, Gary, I know you talked a little bit about your side of the fence there when I was reading your bio here. Why don't you tell us about your setup with your TSR 80 at the house there, and how you started doing some programming, sir?
Like Christie and Rob, I had somebody in my life, my parents, that were like, "Hey, he's showing a proficiency for this stuff. Every time we're going to the store, he's fidgeting with this." So they bought me a TRS-80 one year. And the computer by itself, like Rob said, they were expensive. They were not cheap. Floppy drive for a TRS-80 would run you $400. That's a 5 1/4 inch.
Yeah.
And, so having a floppy drive was out of the question. So they bought me the cassette deck for it so that I had a way to save. And then the following year, they got me the joysticks. And then I think I got Dungeons of Daggereth for it. And that was kind of my rig I had, was a little metal table with a TRS-80, a cassette deck, and 2 little joysticks. And I was always like, okay, how do I read the information from that joystick? I just want to know how to do that. And Tandy was really good about giving you a lot of information in the manual that came with it. So you could go to the back of the book and it would say to read joysticks, you're reading X and Y coordinates. They are read this way through this command. And here's an example program. And so I would elaborate on that and say, well, I want to make a dot that moves around the screen. So I'll have it, instead of moving across and leaving all the dots all the way across, I'll just have it clear every time it moves. So I'll put a clear screen in there, and I'll be like, well, that's not very efficient. Maybe I can improve on that. And so it just kind of escalates from there as you're trying to find cleaner ways to do things. But it all started at basic. And after that, my cousin ended up with an Atari 600 XL. And I was like, holy crap, this thing's a Cadillac compared to what I got. And so I messed around with it, but not as much because he had that at his place, and I only got to play with it every once in a while. And I can remember being completely amazed by the fact that it even had a drawing tablet for it, pressure sensitive drawing tablet.
Mm.
And after that, I kind of died off and kind of fell into like the NES era. And then what I knew about programming, I would play those games. I'd be like, well, that's basically an if then going, if I make a collision, then I do this. Or if I'm below this value, then this needs to happen. And I started to draw the lines between games and programming, and it just started to click with me. And I always wanted to dive into programming for one of those machines, but I knew it was assembly or machine or a more complex language. So I just kind of kept pursuing basic and then moving up when with the PC into like C and C sharp, just kind of walking up the levels. And if you start with like C++, it can be overwhelming. And so I figured if I walked through them, I'd have a wider range to work with, and maybe one tool's not as good at one job as another might be. And I kind of feel that way about game engines too. One can typically be better suited for certain jobs. And that all comes from starting from there and kind of playing with it and experimenting on your own.
I think that's great advice. I wanted to pop up here a picture real fast for those wondering who can't imagine what we're talking about. This either this picture is in just black and white, or it may actually be one of the color machines. It just wasn't taken as a color photograph. But this is the TRS 80, and it does have the cassette deck over there, which to my mind, when I was a kid, I only knew cassette decks as being something to play my my audio cassettes that I bought. Or back in the day, being a kid of the 80s, there was Teddy Ruxpin. I could put my cassettes in there and Teddy Ruxpin would move his mouth and talk. Or I could find a Metallica tape and put it in there and make Teddy Ruxpin sing Inner Sandman or something like that later on down the road. But I never had the experience of being able to save my information down to an audio cassette. That's amazing. I do know that they were only 300 baud, and I never quite understood the conversion there of baud to what that meant to me with kilobytes later on, because for the most part I was dealing with 5 1/4 floppy disks and 3.5 floppy disks. So baud I always thought of as a modem type thing. But
It's a much smaller pile of data than
yeah,
what
I
you.
definitely assumed it was going to be smaller. I just had no idea of orders of magnitude how much smaller. So
That I'm not sure of.
I think
know
baud is just bits per second. I think there's some.
oh, so that's telling you how fast it's coming off of the tape, as
Yeah,
opposed to how the
and
capacity
how
is.
fast it gets saved to it. I think there's some. Parity overhead to that's involved in it, but I think you can roughly take it as bits per second.
Yeah, I know on the Commodore they had some problems where sometimes the data would come back corrupted from the tape, and you could lose a whole program because they didn't have a very good parity system on it.
So I'm wondering, going back around, you all talked about how you got in and a little bit of your, your baby steps into it. But starting back with Christie, you said that you got you a book, you learned how to make a web page. I'm curious to know, based on that first introduction, where did you take it from there? Where did you go? Did you stick with web? Did you expand? What type of projects were you able to work on? Because we do have a viewer here that's following along with us, ex Blue Sin, and they're talking about the fact that it's amazing that you guys know so much of this stuff. But part of the reason why I wanted to have a particular session like this is to show that everybody starts someplace and everybody's path is different. So based on you talking so far, Christie, about coming in and HTML and a web page being the hook for you, where did that journey continue from there?
I think the main thing is it was so exciting for me to just see something turn from code into what was on the screen, and to have control over it. And once you start seeing that you have control over how things look and how they feel and how they work, was really exciting for me. So I started off in just static HTML, and then I was working as a maid. I got a job working at a Blockbuster, actually. And then I just decided I was going to go for it. I was like, I feel like I know enough to try to get like a designer, a developer position. And I actually got two offers around the same time, but I took the one that I thought would challenge me the most, and it's because there were databases involved, and I'd worked only with static websites, and it was scary, but it was also exciting because it was something new. And so it was Cold Fusion and SQL Server. I think there was some Access at the time, and I've stuck mostly with SQL Server, Cold Fusion, PHP, .NET, some .NET stuff now. But the I can't remember where I'm going with this. I think just the excitement of always learning something new and like just taking chances, even if I didn't think, if I wasn't extremely confident in taking that chance, is really how I've been able to make a career out of it. Do things that scare you, and even if you don't think it's possible, just keep trying at it.
That is excellent advice. Rob, what about you? After being able to toy around the stores and getting yourself a TRS-80, when did it start to bloom and go further into other projects?
Pretty quickly. I mean, I remember the first. I don't know how I wound up doing it or how I was introduced to the guy or anything, but as a young teenager, I got my first contract to write software for a food broker in Barbersville, and I wrote it in BASIC. I had to come up with my own little database scheme and everything because there wasn't anything like that written. I got paid to do that. I was so young that my mom would drive me over there for business meetings, and she'd sit in the parking lot and wait while I go in and present design documents, get signed off on things, get some feedback. I'd go back, get in the car, and go back, and I'd work on it at home. I was getting paid. I don't know what my parents thought about that, but wow. Yeah, that was a long time ago. But
I mean, that's a far cry from being driven to like baseball practice, you know?
Yeah. It's a little different, yeah. But I did other things besides programming at about that point. I started branching into like hardware. I remember that I used to build computers for some of the college kids that were starting Marshall and stuff. They, instead of buying an IBM or whatever, some of them would get me to build them a PC clone. I made pretty good money doing that. Wow. And then I did started setting up computers for businesses and stuff, and troubleshooting things like that. So I started doing that kind of contracting and everything. And I think during that period of time, I did programming more for me. Like, I think that was when I was writing nascent instant messenger things and stuff for the internet that was just starting to come up. Exploring a little bit more with web technologies. I learned Cold Fusion about that time, language Christie was talking about using. Prior to that, I think doing programming for a web page involved CGI, Common Gateway Interface, not computer graphics, and using something like Perl or Perl scripts or something like that, and then Cold Fusion came along and really opened it up and let you do things with databases that were really cool. So by about that time, I started getting sucked back into programming more professionally because of the web and that kind of stuff. So, and since then, it's been web and mobile based stuff, and with that has come a shift in languages too. I went from basic, and I dabbled in assembler for a little bit, and went to C++ because that's what video games were made in. And if I were doing something for me, like the instant messenger stuff, it was C and C++. And then all these web-based languages, I was kind of a snob about it for a while. I was ashamed to say I turned my nose up at, okay, JavaScript is not real programming. And, I was a real snob for a long time, but I stand corrected. Most of what I do now is in JavaScript. So
it's okay to have been a snob about JavaScript, because what it could do for you was put like a stock ticker at the top of your screen, and everyone needed that. That was the killer app. That's the big thing JavaScript could do then. It can do way more now.
Yeah. It has evolved quite a bit, but and hopefully so have I. But to answer your question, to get back to that, I very early on started doing contract work. I've only a few times in my life have I had like a straight job working for somebody else, and with mixed results.
Did you say you did Navy, something for the Navy?
Yeah.
That's how I got started, actually. When my first job was actually for the Navy, civilian contract. And my first big project was a night vision goggles inventory system, which was very basic CRUD database system. But at the time, I was like, how am I designing something for night vision goggles? Like,
pretty heady, isn't it?
Yeah, considering I was a maid, a few years prior. So.
And you got from point A to that point B, just all self-taught.
Yeah.
Yeah. Me too. I mean, my formal education initially was biology pre-med, and I dropped out, and because I was doing computer stuff and making good money doing that. But yeah, all the stuff that I've done computer side has all been, and then I went back later for physics and applied math. But the my Navy thing was one of those instances where I had a straight job, and that was actually pretty nice, but it was also kind of sad because I was brought onto that project to do the wireless mesh networking for these unmanned boats, and then I was doing my part, and it was okay. And they said, well, while you're down there, you have programming experience and everything. Won't you supervise these, the developers? So we had a team of developers here in West Virginia, and we would work in Virginia Beach. We'd work remotely. We'd go down there every once in a while when you had to be on the boats or do something hands-on. And they said, well, you be the project manager for the West Virginia team. I'm like, okay, that's great. So I had two hats. I'd take care of the wireless networking stuff, which was pretty straightforward. But then I had all these developers who were working on programming unmanned boats that were swimming around in the ocean and doing cool things. And I didn't get to do that. I had to be a supervisor. So here I am being a supervisor and not actually programming. And that was very sad for me. It kind of sucks the joy out of it. I think if you do this professionally, that might be a hazard. At least it would be for me. If you do this professionally in an organization, I think once you advance up to a certain point, you don't get to be a programmer anymore. You're a herder of programmers. You're a shepherd, and you don't write code, and that's sad. It was sad for me. So
you wanted to play with the toys, not be the toy department manager.
I don't know if you heard me, but they were writing code that controlled unmanned boats that were That was amazing.
That was the coolest sentence I've heard all year, Rob. I promise. I am curious. I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier, just out of my personal curiosity, and maybe
Mhm.
people out there who've done it. These days, you can go to PC Parts Picker and go out there and build yourself a PC. But at the time you were talking about building PCs, it would have been IBM clones.
Mhm.
Out of curiosity, to what extent were you building these? I mean, at the time, were you still able to go out there and buy a particular motherboard and buy your processor? Uh, I didn't know how built to own they were back then.
Yes, you could do that. It was just much more difficult. There was a giant, thick magazine that would come out every once in a
PC
while.
Shopper.
Yeah, PC Shopper or Computer Shopper, something like that. And it had a list of all these different, um, people that were selling parts or full-blown systems. I'd order parts there. And then I found out that there were maybe 3 big national distributors. So I wound up getting an account with one of the big national distributors, and they were in Chantilly, Virginia, I think. And I went out there once to get a bunch of parts, and the people came out and were looking for whatever corporation or whatever I was calling myself at the time. And here's this teenager with his mom, put the parts in the truck. They just shook their heads. So yeah, you could still build computers at the time. They were big, boxy, inelegant, nasty looking things. But oh my God, yeah, there it is.
I just have to tell people this book, when you would get it, think about a college textbook. And I want you to make it be about an inch thick. You would buy this book, it would come out monthly, and it was printed on the same paper. It was very, very thin, like newsprint paper or telephone book paper. What are those? But yeah, I would get this. It was like my Sears wish list catalog. I would go through there and look at all the computers and decide which one I was going to get. I just didn't know, based on when you were talking about how prolific all those parts manufacturers were at that point, or where it was still pretty proprietary.
It was that era right there. That's exactly where we were. There were some competing standards, just like now things change, standards change and everything, but it was doable.
So, Gary, you talked about being able to build you kind of a D&D based game when you were I feel like you've mentioned for a science fair, which probably would have been in elementary school. I figure somewhere in that area.
It
When
was
did
8th grade.
8th grade? Okay, so from there progressing on up, I know in your bio, your intro, I mentioned you actually made 2 games that were out on PC and the Xbox. How far in did that happen? Did life happen in between, and then you came back to it, or how did that actually go?
A lot of life happened in between. There was the wife, the kids, and a lot of things in between that space. Because as I come out of middle school and into high school, there's not much of a IT tech or computer based push. So I'm trying to figure out how to follow through with it and go forward with it, but there's no real leads. Vocational school does some, but it's mostly electronic repair. So it's more like PC repair, IT type servicing, not a whole lot of computer programming. And I looked at Marshall, but they didn't have anything at that time because we're talking, I think I got out of high school around 92 or 3, somewhere in there. And they didn't have a whole lot in their program as far as computer programming went. It was like Ada and a couple of languages, Fortran, a couple of languages like that, stuff that were at that time already starting to fade. But there was a lot of demand in our area for it because a lot of the companies here are about 15 years behind what the standards are. And I knew I needed C++. I needed to have a better grasp on how to program. And I just, as life was going on, I would try to learn a new language. Visual Basic came out. I was like, well, okay, let's see what this is about. So I tore into it, and I was like, oh, Well, I can use DirectX with that. Well, if I can use DirectX, maybe I can write minor networking. And I set up a thing where one end could say, you could say hello, it would transmit to the other almost like an instant messaging software and show up on the other side. Then I elaborated on it, made it a server, had two of them. I could send a message through one end to the other and back. And that kind of grew into a 2D RPG that was a prototype that never got any further, where you could actually move your guy around and send chats. And it was 2D rendered in DirectX 7, but it was going through WinSock, I think, at the time. Is that data for you, Rob? And I could move around in a map, and a player on this computer could see me move on that map, but it was going through a server on my desktop. So I'd have to have two friends bring their desktops over to do this because having three computers in the house was unheard of. And that just kind of escalated as I was going through life. And I finally hit a job that I got, they were doing layoffs. So they let me go at November with December rolling around. And I was like, well, crap, this sucks. And the missus goes, you've sat on games for too long. You have a game engine you paid money for that you haven't done anything with yet. Why don't you see if something happens? So I built Rofaxin in the span of about 4 weeks after getting dropped off from there. And in that span of time between then and like the second week of December, I built that game. Drew it up on, took old drawings that were from when I'd done the science fair project and thinking, well, I could do something like this, but maybe do it like the old Star Trek text base. And it just kind of sat on a shelf, and I went, well, this would have to be completely redone, but the concept's not a bad idea. So I took and I ported it over and then applied that theme from the 90s 16-bit era shooters to it. And the ultimate payoff for it was I delivered a game complete. It may have had bugs. It may not have been the prettiest on the marketplace, but it was there. It held its own. It kind of got buried because GTA came out at the same time. So, but I could actually say I actually did it. And there were problems with the engine, and I had to force myself to learn C# in a short period of time. So I started to gain my C# skills at that point too. So it was a long trek from science fair project and getting a TRS-80 to actually deploying the first, what I consider my first legitimate game.
Sorry, I was having to scroll over a giant landscape of monitors here with a little trackpad. So, I mean, really, some of that impetus was the fact that you were basically furloughed or laid off, and it became well, let's try the passion project now that life's kind of gotten out of the way in that regard, huh?
Yeah, yeah, and then once it came out, and it did all right, I guess, for someone's first game, but it wasn't like Meat Boy kind of big or anything like that. Now, I didn't have any false expectations on that. A lot of early game developers have that mistake that their first game is going to be Super Meat Boy, Binding of Isaac, and that's not going to happen. That's rare.
Yeah, I
But
just happen to have your stuff from the last week just to show people what you're talking about there. It's a side scroller shooter like a would that be Galaga back in the day or Gladius?
more like Gradius and R-Type, um, Lords of Thunder, Gates of Thunder, because it had a real heavy metal soundtrack to it, and it was meant to kind of pace with the action on screen. So a metal or maybe an electronic soundtrack seemed to be the better options for a soundtrack as opposed to something more low key.
Just out of curiosity, for people out there who may be like, "Oh, so this is an independent person making this game." I know that I'm sure things are much faster now. Things are much you can accelerate your creation of code, but back then, how how many man hours do you think it took you to make this, to then say that clearly these days you could probably do it in half the time or even more? But just to give people an idea, how long do you think it took for you to make something like this?
Well, it was my first legit release. It was a one-man show. I had the musician had to drop out for personal reasons. The artist gave me what he had, and then he had to drop out. And so I basically had some assets, an engine, and about 4 to 5 weeks to make it happen. And under those conditions, I don't think it turned out badly, but at the same time, I feel like it could have been done a lot better. And even with something like Unity or Unreal, I think I could do a much better job with it and do it in a much shorter time frame.
Okay. So this will kind of lead into my next question. So I'll go ahead and let you answer it while you're on it. When from Rofaction did you then move on to Kerbang? Because I know that was another big project for you.
That one started almost about a 2-week period after I kind of caught my breath because, well, and you had asked about man hours. I was out of work, so I was staying. I'm watching the kids running them off to school. The missus is working while I'm doing that, and I was like, well, um, I can work as many hours as I need to. So I would do 12-hour days, 16-hour days, 18-hour days, and
Oh wow.
I love to code, and I catch myself having to rein myself in all the time because once I get started, I'm like, I can do one more thing, I can get that working, and then I can stop. And I get that done, I'm like, maybe just one more thing. And I have to catch myself because I'm really bad for that. Because I'm like, it's like a kid eating a candy bar. It's like, oh, that's good. I need another bite. Oh, that's really good. More. And so as I got writing code, I finally got to a point towards the end of it where I was like, okay, 10 hours my max limit, 5 days a week. I'm gonna have to rein myself in or I'll make myself sick. And so once I got that rhythm going, I waited about 2 weeks. I set up the idea for Kabang. I was playing some old Atari games with my son at the time, and we were just kind of had it hooked up was playing it, and we were playing Kaboom, and I was like, this wouldn't be too hard to implement in that engine I've got, even though it's got some issues on how to address them. But you're basically one sprite moving left to right. Sprites drop down, basically under gravity. You collect that. So what if you threw power ups in? And then I started going, well, what if the backgrounds changed? What if it wasn't so bland? What if I did this? What if I did that? And then I just kind of elaborated from there and put that together in a prototype, but I never deployed it on that engine because I kept running into problems with it. It did not play well with joysticks and profiles. It always ran into huge problems. So I eventually waited until I learned enough about Unity that I could use it as my learning tool for Unity because it is a simple concept. So it's like, okay, so I'm going to learn UI and basic menu movement. I'm going to learn player input and rigid body and physics. I'm going to learn, manual manipulation of things on a screen by transform, translate, and things like that. So I just basically used it as a teaching tool to teach me how to use Unity. And I think that's why it looks a lot rougher because I didn't have art assets. So I had assets I paid for, and I would go in and kind of doctor them a little bit just to at least show that I made an effort. But it was never really meant to be anything more than something to play between games you were waiting on. So,
Well, I think the nice thing about both of your examples, it just kind of hit me, was that you just mentioned there with Kerbang, it was with regards to scope of your project, you narrowed it in. You weren't making an open world game because that's going to be unrealistic probably for one person. But both of the games you made, you could quickly prototype. You could figure out the scope of your project, and you as one person could handle most of those areas. So that's, I think that would be a good thing for people out there who are probably in any discipline of programming is don't don't try to quickly go ahead and make yourself a Facebook. Don't try to make a database with all this extra stuff. Try to start with a smaller thing and maybe build upwards, just so you can complete and, as you say, learn those lessons that you can use for the next one and the next one and the next one.
And don't let clients drag you down the scope creep path either. Right, Christie?
No.
I'm always a fan of making sure you write up that contract, have them sign off on it, so that you can say, "This is what you wrote. This is what I'm doing. Sign here, sign here, sign here. Pay me my money."
Our
And then
first
out to the
semester, I saw some guys that were like talking. They were like, "Hey, we could do for our blockout example, we could do an MMO." I'm like, "You're out of your mind. Do you know how much is involved with that?" An MMO is not just like, I want to write an RPG on a piece of paper and then apply that to a computer. There's a lot to that. There's networking and servers and clients and then the graphics and then the whole thing is a lot. Your first game should not be an RPG.
right. Well,
Those
don't tell Jeremy Doolin that, because he's doing a good job. It's taking him a couple years, but don't tell him that, because it looks
it's
amazing.
well, unless you understand fully what you're getting into. That
Sure,
should be
right.
probably the better way to phrase it, because there is so much more than just turn-based combat in it. And a lot of people
Mhm.
go, well, turn-based combat, that's easy. Or hack and slash, that's easy. Well, it is simple in the way it appears, but there's a lot going on under the hood.
So my next question was going to be, and I think Gary, you've answered it. So I'll come back around to Christy and then to Rob. But you're more than welcome to fill in there if you have more. Is that to some degree, when I called this software developers roundtable, I called it that because when you have a love for programming, when you know an actual language, there's so many diverse ways you can go about doing things. So I just wondered if Christy and then Rob, if you could talk about, just mention some of the diverse projects you've been involved on that have all funneled in through programming, to show people that, like, it's not just one thing you have to do. It can be so exciting that, like, one day you can be working on a Navy contract, and the next day you can be working on an IDS, that type of thing. Like, the sky's the limit, just by hearing some of the examples and the different paths you've gone down for your all's programming projects.
I feel like when I look back, there's always something, even if I thought it wasn't that valuable, or even if I struggled with something, for some reason it comes back up later, and I'm grateful that I learned that thing, I I fussed through learning how to do charts that way, or use a different technology that maybe an employer wanted to use, or something that was outside of my wheelhouse and outside of my comfort zone. It seems like those cases, they come back later and you're grateful for them. So I think just being able to use any learning experience to grab hold of something that you can use later, because it seems like that my career is very, if you would look at it on paper, it's from, like you said, from the Navy to telecom to the mining industry, to medical industry, and it's kind of all over the place. But I use the same similar technologies through all of those. And now Gary's got me wanting to develop a game. I haven't done that yet. So it was really fun listening to your history, Gary. By the way, I love Super Meat Boy and Binding of Isaac. So yeah, it was.
I have a lot of respect for the team that created that game. There's so much storytelling he does in such a simple design idea. It should be something that a lot more people take notice of as when they go to design their games.
Yeah.
You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to tell a good story and make a fun game to go with it, and it all comes together.
There was a really good documentary that kind of followed them and the creator of Fez and the creator of Braid, called Indie Game the Movie, for anybody out there
Yep.
who's curious about what we're talking about. Yeah, it was a two-person team, I think, that did Super Meat Boy. So check out Indie Game the Movie. Excellent movie. Christie, you had actually mentioned in your bio, I think you mentioned to me previously too, that you haven't just done programming. You also had done some character creations for uh, something game Apocalypse LLC. So do you want to talk about that and how being a programmer may take you down extra roads you didn't even expect?
Well, that's interesting because that kind of the first time I was tasked with doing some animation, I really hated it. It was very stressful, and I was trying to make things move and trying to make things happen. And what I had in my head, I just couldn't easily make happen. But it took a few of those projects of me and there was one thing a couple of years ago I had to do a Christmas card for our IT department and just do something simple like make reindeer go across the screen, and it was not at the time it wasn't that exciting for me, but then I just kept doing it and kept trying, and then I started getting into gaming and actually did some like Twitch overlays for Logan Radio Rocks, who's a great streamer, by the way. He's streaming right now, probably. I think he streams like 11. And then like just some logos for people. I just did one for this gaming community, Part-Time Slackers Gaming. So some of those things that, like I said earlier in the beginning, when you feel like, why do I have to do this? Or why am I learning this? Or it just feels uncomfortable. Like it kind of ends up coming back around to you later.
I agree. I've done some programming previously, and Rob, you're more than welcome. There's no NDA. You can mention that I did at one time actually work with you. So I know that all the programming for the most part that I ended up learning ended up being when Rob and I were doing a lot of independent programming. I learned VB in college. I'd already dabbled with some HTML, but I learned Cold Fusion and PHP and MySQL. What I find was, everything I've done has somehow paid off later down the road. So I think whether you listen to this as you're a programmer or you want to be a programmer, in general, I think if you have the opportunity to do something, don't say why not, because more often than not, like Christie's saying, like Gary's been saying as well, so many of those things later on can pay off for you on down the road. This whole setup here that I'm doing, the camera, the streaming, all this stuff, I dabbled with video, 15 years ago and started playing around with that, and would have never known that streaming was going to be a thing, or this would be a thing, or that I'd occasionally do commercials for people. It was just something I like to do. And then suddenly they go, oh, by the way, didn't you do X, Y, or Z? So whether it's programming, whether it's computers, whether it's anything else in your life, why not do it? It's going to be an extra experience you're going to have. And that's going to be extra you can bring to even an interview when someone's saying like, why would you be good for this job? Your personal experiences are your own personal experiences, and they're going to be unique from anybody else. And that may be something that gets you that contract, get your foot in the door, that type of thing. So I completely agree with all those sentiments. So Rob, what about you? Can you talk about the variety of paths that programming has taken you down to where people are out there can say like, it's not going to necessarily be 4 white walls in a boring room all the time. It doesn't have to be 4 white walls and a boring room if you stare at the computer all the time. You can have different passions, and the very next day you may get a call about a contract that you're going to absolutely love.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I like about doing contractor work is the variety of different projects that you get to work on. Probably some of the most unhappy periods of my professional career have been when I've been in, 4 white walls typing on a screen for one particular project. That's, but then I switched jobs and wound up working on various client computers and on a naval project. So those kinds of things, there are so many different paths and so many different opportunities out there for software development. And like everybody said, the skills that you develop on any project, even if it's a passion project, even if it's something that you've worked on a little bit and that you never released it or anything, Gary knows how to do low-level network programming now. And, you know, you never know when that's going to come up. I personally, you know, had learned C, C sharp, or C++, some C sharp, but had moved kind of away from that kind of thing. And when I was working on the Navy project, like I said, I was doing wireless mesh networking for those unmanned boats. And the way they communicate, the way a wireless mesh works is if one node doesn't have a direct connection to a distant node, as long as there's a path between them, the mesh networking algorithm can figure out a way of getting that communications to it. And just that little bit of experience that I gained doing that project allowed me to later, I personally developed a system of remote school bus lights, bus stop warning lights for obstructed curves and hills, like we have a lot of here in Appalachia. But I was able to use that knowledge of the way that those boats communicated network-wise with some of the old C, not C++, but C level coding that I'd learned before to develop this Internet of Things application.
Talking about Borland C?
Yeah, that's what I started with, yeah. And but then some of the tool chains for developing for these microcontrollers that I built into the electronics, you know, the tool chain, the highest level language you have available is like C or something like that at the time, with what I picked. So all of that stuff kind of came together and allowed me to develop something completely new that, you know, I wouldn't have dreamed that those disparate experiences would come together. So yeah, your skills that you develop working on anything are never wasted. I mean, you can draw on them, even if it's just drawing on them in analogy, to do something new. So
very nice. So I know you all talked about the fun stuff, the passion projects, and Rob, you alluded to the fact that you, to some degree, if there's a project that you ultimately begin to hate, that project's going to eventually be over and there'll be another contract to somebody else. But if programming is your passion, let's talk about the fact that as indie people, as people who are not necessarily working for a corporate structure at all times, you occasionally have to pay bills. You got to pay contractors who are doing your music and doing your game design. You got to cut checks for people and stuff. So can you all, we'll start with Christie and go back around again. Can you all talk about the business side of things? Because maybe it's a stereotype, but I think from what I've heard before, programmers aren't always the best people at being business people. So how have you fought that and made sure that, you know, you get your bills paid and the electricity stays on and you pay your workers if you're doing sort of, you know, independent people doing your coding, that type of thing? How does the business side work? And was it foreign to you? How would you advise people who are thinking about doing this, and what would you warn them about on the business side, because they love programming but they may be clueless about business?
Wrong button. Well, I've actually tried to work independently a couple of times, and for the same reasons. You know, making sure people paid on time and having to wear so many hats and focus on programming, and then also invoicing and learning about taxes. And there's just a lot more that you take on. And it was just overwhelming. I did it as just like side contracts and things like that. And when I first really was just like, okay, I'm just going to do contract work, it was stressful, and I think I just wasn't ready. But I tried again, and it's kind of something that one silver lining of COVID for me is I started working from home, and I just set myself up a little bit better this time so that I hope that I can maintain it. And I have monthly recurring clients, which definitely help with that. I don't feel like I'm hunting for more work or the next electricity bill. Yeah. And it is such I think that with programming for me and a lot of people that I know is you are so passionate about it that you have very high highs, but you can also have very low lows if it's really stressful or finances are overwhelming or anything like that. So I just set myself up for it a little bit better this time. I saved up money. I lived below my means. It was a goal that I'd had for a little while. My dad was an engineer, and he actually became a contractor towards the end of his career. And he always talks about those were the best years of his life, and those were the best years of his career, and how happy he was. So he was always kind of in my corner, encouraging it, which really helped. And I still have, I'm still learning a lot. I mean, taxes are just things like that. Taxes, accounting, invoices. You kind of have to. The salesperson aspect, I'm not good at all either. But you do have to wear a lot of hats, and it can be overwhelming. But I don't know. I have grit. I don't ever want to give up on something. So I'm going to keep trying until I make it work.
Any life hacks out there for people, or any life cheats you can figure out when it comes to getting your business license or dealing with the state, or any of that stuff that you've picked up that you think may be useful for someone just starting off, Christie?
I Google a lot, but I also am not afraid to ask questions, especially if people that's been there and done that. I do have some friends that have started up businesses, so they were great resources to just, how do you handle taxes, and who do you use for a CPA, and what's your advice for this, and how should I do this part of my bookkeeping? And generally, I found with people that are in IT or in small business at all, we're really eager to help each other out, and if someone, even a stranger, came to me, I would not hesitate to just give a bunch of links and give them any advice that I had to kind of help them out. So
great. Yeah, so look out there for communities. Maybe if you're doing game development, look out there for one of those user game, what's it called, Gary? I'm trying to think, like Unreal user game groups. Is that right?
I believe so. I can't remember the name either.
Look for Discord channels. Look for other like-minded individuals that can give you some advice. That would be a great thing to do.
Yeah.
What about you, Rob?
Oh, well, I've tried it a number of different ways. Having partners and stuff like that, that's not always a good thing. And for me, it hasn't been. But I would add to what Christie said, play to your strengths. Mine's not marketing, but I've been lucky enough to, well, one of the good things about being a contractor and definitely being a contractor in this area is, you don't have to work a lot if you live below your means. If you're, it's a pretty low cost of living in this area compared to other places that we might find ourselves professionally. And I've always been willing to make the trade-off of having more time and less money, because to me, that's the only thing you can't get more of. But I've been fortunate enough to know several developers that want as much money as they can and will juggle too many projects and are happy to outsource them to me. So if you can align yourself with somebody whose strengths are more towards the marketing side of things, I'm happy to pick up excess from people and help with their projects and stuff, because my strength is not going out and chasing those things. And so yeah, that would be a little bit of advice. And yeah, find those tech meetups and user groups, because that's where you'll meet people that are maybe doing this professionally and have maybe been doing it longer than you. So no programmer is an island, even though we kind of feel like it sometimes, or like to think we are sometimes. Not if you're doing it professionally.
Great advice. Gary, do you have any advice? Were there any, business type of things you had to set up when you started creating your two games and putting them out there?
If I knew now if I knew then what I know now, I would have been a lot more smart about how I did it. Because even if you sell just a small volume of games, Uncle Sam's getting his piece, and West Virginia is certainly getting their piece. I know, like, as far as a business license goes, this is probably the better state to go with to get one in. It's very inexpensive. It's quick and to the point. You can do it online. It's not a very hard process at all. And so getting started and having a low cost of living here is actually kind of a smart idea for a business. And so when it comes to the taxes and stuff, I didn't fully understand all that stuff. So I kind of had to straighten all that out, getting all that back in order. And it wasn't a whole lot of sales, but they still wanted their chunk of the pie. And it doesn't matter if you sell one copy and you make a quarter, they're going to want their chunk of that quarter. And you have to track everything. Keep a good eye on everything you're doing. Make you a spreadsheet if you got to. A spreadsheet, a Word document, something. Just keep a log of what's going on. And most sites like Steam and Xbox and PlayStation and Nintendo, they give you feedback on how many copies you sold, how many were freebies that you gave to journalists and stuff like that. So you can keep track of all that. And having someone that's an accountant is probably not a bad idea, because having somebody that understands money better than me is like the only thing that saved my rear end. Because I didn't go to, I didn't go to an accountant. I went to the missus. I was like, help. And she's like, all right. And she starts running the math on it. She's like, okay, we'll send them this, and that should get the thing squared away.
So, Rob, you actually added a link here I want to pop up, and I'll pop a little banner too. Will you tell us about this link?
Yeah, West Virginia actually makes it super easy to set up a business. You just go to this website, create an account, and that steps you through all the processes for standing up a business in West Virginia. So if there are any aspiring entrepreneurs out there, you can do it pretty quickly and inexpensively right there. It's surprising to me that West Virginia, I sometimes think of us as being behind the curve on a lot of things. They make it incredibly easy, like Gary said, to stand up a business here.
That's what really shocked me, is on a lot of stuff like that. It's only been the last year or two that we've been able to renew a driver's license online.
Yeah.
And that online one-stop business portal's been around for a while now. And when Jeff, the guy that was with me at the Expo in 2019, where we were all a part of the Wolfpack group, and he went and applied for an LLC and did all that through there. And I helped him fill it out, and it only took like 15 minutes. And
Wow.
so that's a pretty quick fill out. I know, like in states like California and New York, you're looking at huge tax costs and a lot of paperwork.
Yeah, the most time-consuming part of the process is getting your FEIN number back from the federal government.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna have one more question for you all, and then we'll open it up to questions. But one question has already come in I'll let you all kind of field now if you want, based on your all's experience. I know a lot of you all here we're talking were self-taught, but also information's a lot more prolific out there. It's all over the place, and so where would you think now, somebody out there who's thinking about getting into the industry, what advice would you have? Where should they go? Where should they start?
For IT as a major as a whole, or just programming alone?
If you want to go ahead and hit it on programming, if you want to hit it on game design, that's fine. I mean, this is a software development, arena here, but
Honestly, for programming, which is what I'm most familiar with, for me, I think a lot of where I got a lot of my help from came from others, like others that were interested in it, discussion forums, Discord channels, Facebook groups, Twitter groups on Twitter, other indie developers. Like I think it was Christie that said earlier, we are a group of people and an industry that does not hold secrets from one another. Like, oh, well, let me show you how to do that. I screwed that up. I can help you avoid that if you just do it this way. And so there's a lot of help out there before you ever make that jump into an IT major, where you can kind of get some information while you're in the process of getting your schooling started. So you can kind of get rolled into it without it being just such a culture shock.
Yeah, I would just say as a follow up there for you a second, Gary, you made 2 games and you were a game developer and then you went to Mount West. So, I mean, Christy, I know you mentioned being self taught. Rob, you were mainly self taught, but then you went for physics and math. Gary, you were the person that did programming, made games, and then you went to school. So that might sound backwards to people. Can you explain your logic on that one?
Well, it's kind of like baking a pie that comes out of the oven and you go, that's close, but that's not quite right. So when I looked at Rifaxton and Kerbang, I was like, well, that's close. It's not quite there. I need to do a little more with this. So my wife was like, okay, this last job did another layoff. She's like, you're going to school and you're going to do what you love doing. And she's like, I found Mount West has a really solid game development program. It's got things for technical writing in it. It's got things for other languages other than what the game engines use. So you have a nice rounded education to support you. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, maybe that's what I've been missing all along, is the fundamentals that you get from a structured learning environment to kind of help prop everything up. That's why it was almost there, but not quite. And that's why I went back to school. And I got to say, since I have had Rob's class and other classes like that, I've seen different ways to structure if then and if else and different ways to structure methods and functions and to structure code in a more concise way that has really helped me go back and troubleshoot. And with my job I have now, I've been able to go back to code that I've had mistakes in and go, oh, there it is, and 5-minute fix. So for me to go back to school at 40 some years old was a little daunting. And I'm older than a lot of the professors. I'm almost twice my game development professor's age. And so it was a little awkward, but it was worth it, because what I got out of it was the framework I needed to build everything else on. I tried to build the house before I had a foundation.
I guess too, kind of going back to what all of you are saying, finding a community that you can ask questions to, because we're all going to gladly help you, but you got to find the people to ask the questions. I guess too, to some degree, you found an extra community there of like-minded people you could pick their brains and show your stuff to as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think having people that are like yourself that are just as novice kind of helps. Whenever you phrase a question, they kind of get where you're coming from, because somebody's well versed that may have forgotten what it was like at the beginning. May go, "What in the world is he talking about?" So you end up with answers, but you don't fully understand because they don't have a way to translate that down to you.
True, true. They're a programmer, but maybe not that good of a teacher to be able to break down that complex concept in a analogy that makes sense for you. So Rob,
Digestible format.
right. So Rob, Christie, do you all have any advice for somebody where they should start, where they should start looking these days to try to get into programming, whether it be, desktop, web, mobile app, gaming, any of that stuff?
There's a lot of great resources out there if you want to just start learning how to code, like freecodecamp.org. I think's amazing, actually. I mean, I've clicked through those. Someone wanted to learn Bootstrap, and I just kind of clicked through to see what it was about, and it's actually really, really well done. There's some other websites out there where you can take classes for free or even cheap. And then also we're just passionate people about programming. So if you just find a passionate programmer and just say, hey, I'm really interested in learning about this. I mean, and with the technology we have now, especially with, it's changed a lot because of quarantine, but you can screen share, you can peer program, you can watch someone code. Like if there's something you're interested in, but you're not really sure, like maybe I want to do game development, maybe I want to get into databases. If you know someone that you can ask, I would say most of the time we would all help someone that wanted to just learn a little bit about the industry. I don't think I've ever met, like it's what Gary was saying, I don't think I've ever met anyone in the industry that had like some guarded secrets that, it's exciting helping people learn. So
occasionally I've seen some very sarcastic and nasty comments on buffer overflow. Like if you don't do your homework and try to work through something first, they're like, no, we're going to chastise you first. But you're right. They'll let you know, but they may be snarky in the beginning.
And a lot of it's in good humor. They're just like, hey, look, you need to do your homework before you start coming to us, or we're going to make you regret it. And they just want you to make that extra push to try to sort it out before you go ask them for help, because that's how you learn.
I have to admit, I have replied to a comment with, here, let me Google that for you.
I know you have, Rob. You were the snarky person in the bunch. I know. So my last question for you here, and if we get any more in the chat, I'll gladly ask them, is really about West Virginia. And some of you all have already hit upon it, talking about how, it can be very advantageous as long as you're living below your means, that you can do well here, and the cost of living is fairly low. So you don't have to sit there and worry about having 60 clients that you have retainers for, because you can stretch your money a lot more here. But in general, I guess, can you talk about advice you have for doing this type of work in West Virginia, and also to talk about the fact that, hey, out there in the real world, your clients won't always just be in West Virginia. I imagine you all have clients potentially all around the world these days, because I can code and I don't need to travel. I got the internet. So Christie, I'll let you go first there.
I'll just be frank. It's hard in West Virginia. It's harder. There's not, but I mean, it's kind of why I wanted to really try to go independent, is because I don't have as many opportunities here. And there was a time I was driving from Fayetteville to Lewisburg to go to work every day. So you really have to make a lot of sacrifices to work for companies, and sit in that room in an office at a West Virginia based company. And I want to stay here, and I want to be a part of that growth. But it is really hard. I have a couple of clients outside of West Virginia. And then I have one children's book author that's inside of the state of West Virginia that I'm just building a website for and doing some media type stuff for. But it is a lot harder. I did, like Rob said, like live below my means, save money. I don't have a mortgage. I don't even have a car payment. I don't have any debt, actually. So I really kind of set myself up to, I think, kind of go into it without as a lot of stress. so that, if you have a huge house payment and you are trying to find clients strictly in your community, it's probably going to be hard, at times.
For people that may not know the geography between Lewisburg and Fayetteville, how long of a drive would that have been for you one way?
Like an hour and a half, an hour and 20 minutes. But on Fridays, I would have to hit 19 to go to Fayetteville, and they have that Boy Scout Jamboree. So Fridays, sometimes I would leave Lewisburg at 4:30, and I'd get home about 6:30.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, there's definitely some, there's advantages and disadvantages of West Virginia. I love West Virginia. It's affordable. I love the mountains. but it is, the technology industry is not as easy here as it has been in other states for me.
Very true. Rob, what are your thoughts?
Well, I can say that one of the advantages living here, besides some of the things that we've talked about, that's helped me in the past, is that it is a small market. You don't have tons of potential clients, and that forced me to learn a number of different things. I wasn't just a developer. I had to learn networking. I had to learn different different software packages and things like that, and kind of be a jack of all trades. And the first time I went to a larger market, the first time I went to a larger area, I went to DC as a subcontractor for another IT integrator who was better at marketing than I am. And, they said, we met with the client and they said, we need to do this. And I said, okay, I can do that. And they said, well, I thought you were doing the networking stuff. And I was like, well, I can do this too. And, well, we need to do that. Well, I can do that. Okay, you can do that too? Yeah, I can do that too. But in the larger markets, we have a network guy. Well, no, that's our server guy. This is our mail server guy. And then we have a strictly our accounting package person. And then, but knowing a lot of different things. And then also, they'd say, well, we need this. And I said, well, I can do that. And then at lunch, went to the bookstore and found a book on that. And the contractor is like, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm learning how to do that because, they said they about lost it. But having that confidence that you can pick up new skills and do things really helped a lot. So
you have to be nimble here, but that really does help your work ethic.
But it really helps the work ethic, and it helps your broader skill set. I think you're going to find people from West Virginia all over the place being able to do technical, competent things. I mean, I've met them everywhere I've gone, practically doing things, and coming from it's like swinging two bats here, then you get somewhere else where there's a big market and it makes it a little easier. So
excellent advice. Gary, do you have any advice for what it's like to work here in West Virginia?
My biggest complaint for working in this area has to be the internet infrastructure. I mean, I'm probably one of the most fortunate people out of most that I know of at school. I probably have the least amount of outages, the least amount of lag, but I'm buying a commercial line. And if I didn't pay $150 a month for that commercial line at 320 megabit, which is way under the gigabit that you can get in most cities, then you're kind of screwed, because a lot of people, they have disconnects, they have constant lag, they get throttled, they get booted off and it resets, and it's a constant nightmare of trying to get an ISP to understand that the internet is not a luxury for you in specific, because you're not using it to surf the web for YouTube videos. You might be, but it's because you need to know how to do this feature that you've not done yet in Unity or in Unreal, or maybe there's something in Blender because you have to fix a model that's messed up. And they don't get that. They can't wrap their head around it. And so the internet infrastructure in and around Huntington is really hard to work with, especially for the Comcast people.
Yeah, I wondered if you were going to say that C word, because I feel very lucky to not have to deal with that C word at all.
I'm on Armstrong here, where I'm in and around the Cerrito Canova area. So if I was half a mile or a mile or two more to the west towards Huntington, I would be in Comcast.
What's this Comcast you're talking about? You mean Xfinity? It's completely different. It's new. It's better.
You can call it what you want. It's still the same animal underneath.
The great thing is you can drive around Huntington and use anybody else's wireless because.
Oh my gosh, that's terrible.
I can claim my car's a Lamborghini all I want to, but it's not.
Yeah,
I think any cable internet provider is. I mean, here we've got two internet connections just so that there's one stable one, and that's on Suddenlink, and then there's a backup ISDN line.
I'm happy to report in Ironton, Ohio, I have what was Time Warner and is now Spectrum, and it's been heaven since I left Huntington and didn't have to deal with 1.5 megabit Verizon or Comcast that may be up or maybe down. So hopefully the area you live in gives you good, because I'm 100 megabit and that works for me.
And the bad part is, Patrick, you know who Brad Kalinowski is. He went when he was trying to get his visual effects studio going out of Huntington because he wanted to take interns and kind of promote the area and do some business here. He went to the Huntington City Council, and him and several other business owners was like, "Hey, we'd like Verizon to bring Fios together, give us gigabit internet. We could all have a lot more bandwidth, which is what we need." And basically, the oldest, grumpiest guy on the council, who is probably older than Methuselah himself, basically said, "I use the internet for email, and that's all I care about. I'm done with this conversation. I'm not giving them right away to put in fiber optics." And we lost internet because somebody didn't understand how much money they threw out the door.
West Virginia's open for business, though, gentlemen. And Christie, I know, Christie, you haven't really been harping on the actual internet side of the fence. It's been Rob and Gary, but there are some infrastructure pain points, unfortunately. But
that one item isolated, it's cheaper to get and easier to get a business license going. The people are pretty friendly and easy to deal with here. Your cost of living is much, much lower.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure every place has pros and cons, and there's a lot more pros to West Virginia than there are cons.
We all can't have the internet infrastructure that Louisa, Kentucky has. That's top notch.
You mean Lycom cable?
That's the one I meant, Pat.
The one that was put in by two super handsome gentlemen who made sure it was rock solid back in the day.
I remember them being very handsome. Yes.
Yeah.
I remember them being younger and skinnier too.
That's true. Yeah. Who knew that doing programming would wind up you deciding to actually putting cable modem head-ins for people and stuff. So yeah, being nimble is a great skill to have around this tri-state area. Well, thank you all so much for sitting down with me and talking to me about your all's trajectory and advice you would have for people. My ultimate goal with this was I wanted people that were interested in the field to see how diverse things can be, how one size doesn't fit all. Anybody can come to it. As Gary said, Gary went back to college in his 40s. The time is now. There's no time like the present. You don't have to actually be born with a C++ spoon in your mouth. I mean, Rob was for the most part, but doesn't have to be your track at all. I mean, it doesn't hurt, yes, but you can be doing all kinds of different things. Christie, you were actually doing MAID work, which was as far away from programming as computers as possible. So it's just, I like the fact to show people and demystify the fact that if this is something you want to dabble with, you can totally do it, and you can make it your job. And as long as you love it, in theory, you'll never technically work a day in your life if you love it. So thank you all so much for coming and talking to us. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed meeting everyone.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yes. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.